The morning Marcella Barrett knocked on a stranger's back door. She had not eaten in 2 days. Her youngest child was wrapped in a threadbare shawl that offered little protection against the biting November wind of the New Mexico territory. And she had nothing left in the world but the hollow determination of a woman who refuses to watch her children die. It was 1878, deep in the high desert country south of Santa Fe, where the land was as beautiful as it was merciless, where the juniper trees clung to the red earth like old men refusing to fall, and where the winter came sharp and early and showed no sympathy to those caught unprepared. The town of Clayfield sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, a modest collection of buildings that had sprung up around a trading post and a water source that the locals called Redemption Creek. It was not a glamorous place, but it was a place where people lived and struggled and occasionally helped one another, and Marcella had driven her wagon to the edge of it on nothing but desperate hope. She had left her farm 6 days earlier, after the bank's representative had come out with a letter that said what she already knew was coming. Her husband, Thomas Barrett, had been dead for 4 months. He had died of a fever that swept through the valley in the summer, the kind of fever that took men who thought themselves strong and left their families standing in the wreckage. Thomas had not been a bad man. He had been a dreamer, which was sometimes worse, because dreamers borrowed against futures that never quite arrived. The farm had a debt against it that Marcella had not known the full extent of until the letter came, and the letter said that the bank would take possession within 30 days unless the sum of $240 was paid in full. $240 might as well have been $2,000, standing where she stood. So she had packed what she could fit into the wagon, which was not much, and she had taken her 2 children and the horse that was too old and too slow but still breathing, and she had pointed them east toward Clayfield because she had a distant cousin there, a woman named Ruth Aberley, who had written once 2 years ago saying that Clayfield was growing and that there was always work for capable hands. Marcella had not written back. She had meant to, but the seasons had swallowed her intentions whole. Ruth Aberley was not in Clayfield anymore. The woman at the dry goods store, whose name was Mrs. Hooper and who had the narrow, assessing eyes of someone who had seen too many desperate strangers, told Marcella that Ruth had married a cattle driver from Arizona and gone west with him the previous spring. Mrs. Hooper said it in the flat tone of someone delivering information that was not her problem, and Marcella had stood in the middle of the store with her daughter Eleanor's small hand tucked into hers, and her son Daniel pressed against her side, and she had felt the last solid thing beneath her feet dissolve into nothing. She had spent that first night in Clayfield sleeping in the wagon at the edge of town, all 3 of them huddled under every blanket she owned, and she had told the children they were on an adventure, because that was what mothers did. Eleanor was 6, and believed her with the complete and heartbreaking trust of a 6-year-old. Daniel was 8 and did not entirely believe her but said nothing, because he was becoming aware of the weight of things in the way that boys do when they have watched their father's coffin go into the ground. By the second night, the food was gone. Not reduced, not scarce. Gone. The last of the dried beans, the last of the hard bread she had baked before leaving, the last of the dried apple pieces she had been rationing with the precision of a general managing dwindling ammunition. Gone. She had gone to 2 homesteads during the daylight hours of the second day, asking if there was work, any work at all, laundry or mending or cooking, anything. The first family, the Sutter family, had looked at her with a sympathy that was real but helpless. They were struggling themselves, the wife said, and she had pressed a small bundle of cornbread into Marcella's hands with the guilty look of someone giving away more than they could spare. Marcella had taken it and thanked her and given most of it to the children. The second homestead, the Crane property, had set their dog on her before she got to the porch. On the morning of the third day, before the sun came up, before the sky had done anything more than turn from black to the deep bruised purple of approaching dawn, Marcella Barrett wrapped Alina more tightly in the shawl, told Daniel to stay with his sister and not move from the wagon, and walked across the frozen ground toward the light she had seen burning in the back window of the largest property on the north end of Clayfield. She did not let herself think about what she was doing. Thinking about it would have stopped her. She only walked, one foot in front of the other, across the hard-packed earth that crunched under her worn boot heels, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her hands clasped together not in prayer exactly, but in something adjacent to it, the posture of a person who has given themselves over to the only option remaining. The property belonged to Jedediah Finley. Everyone in Clayfield knew who Jedediah Finley was, which is to say that Marcella had heard his name twice in 2 days, which in a town of 300 people meant he was someone of significance. He was a rancher, they said. He kept mostly to himself, they said. He was fair with his workers and paid what he promised and never shorted anyone, which in the West of 1878 made him practically saintly. He had bought the property 6 years ago when the previous owner, a man named Harcastle, had drunk himself out of business and out of the territory, and Jedediah had built it up with the slow and steady patience of a man who understood that things worth having took time. He was 34 years old, though Marcella did not know this yet. She only knew there was a light in his window before dawn, which meant someone was awake, which meant someone might open a door. She knocked. 3 soft knocks, tentative, the way you knock when you are not sure you have the right to knock at all, but you are doing it anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. For a long moment there was nothing, and Marcella's heart seized with the particular terror of a silence that might mean no one is coming, and she pressed her lips together and lifted her hand to knock again, and that was when the door opened. Jedediah Finley stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, and the light from the oil lamp behind him threw him into partial shadow, but she could see enough. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work with their hands and their bodies every day, not the performed width of vanity, but the genuine breadth of real labor. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that had seen 2 days without a razor, and eyes that were the color of good strong coffee, a warm brown that in the lamplight looked almost amber. He was wearing his work clothes already because it was true that he rose before dawn every single morning without exception, a habit he had kept since he was a boy on his father's farm in Tennessee, and there was something settled about him, something still in the way he held himself, that made Marcella think of bedrock even in that first moment. He looked at her. He did not look alarmed, which surprised her. He looked, more than anything, careful. Like a man taking in a situation before deciding how to respond. Marcella opened her mouth to begin the speech she had been composing in her head for the last 100 yards of frozen ground, the speech about being sorry to disturb him and needing work and willing to do anything, and being a capable woman who was not asking for charity only for a chance. But what came out instead was something entirely different. What came out was the truth, stripped of everything she had planned to wrap around it. "I have 2 children in a wagon at the edge of your property," she said. "They have not eaten since yesterday morning, and I do not know what to do." She had not meant to say it like that. She had meant to be stronger, more composed, more practical. But the honesty came out of her with the force of something that had been held too long, and she stood in the cold before-dawn air of November 1878, and she did not look away from his eyes even though every instinct she had was telling her to. Jedediah Finley looked at her for one long beat, and then he said, "Go get them." That was all. Not a question, not a qualification, not a single note of hesitation in his voice. Just a simple instruction delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who had already decided. "Go get them," he said again, and stepped back from the door, and turned toward the stove that was already lit and already warm with the fire he had built an hour ago. And Marcella stared at his back for just a moment, at the width of those shoulders and the economy of his movements, and then she turned and ran back across the frozen ground to her children. She gathered Alina up against her shoulder and took Daniel by the hand and half ran, half walked back across the dark yard, and when she pushed open the back door of Jedediah Finley's kitchen with her elbow, Daniel clutching her hand and Aliner's face pressed warm against her neck, she stopped. He was setting the table. He was setting 3 plates, not 2, not 4, 3. One for her and one for each of her children. He had not asked her. She had not told him. He had simply known or assumed with the quiet certainty of a man who paid attention to people, that a mother who knocked on a door before dawn with 2 days of hunger behind her was not traveling alone. 3 plates set on a wooden table that was clean and solid, with 3 forks placed beside them with a tidiness that spoke of a man who lived with order by choice, not performance. And at the stove, where a cast iron pan was already heating, he was cutting bacon from a slab with a knife that moved with familiar confidence, and a pot of something sat at the back of the stove, sending up a warm, dense smell that made Aliner lift her head from Marcella's shoulder and say, very quietly, "Mama." Marcella felt something break open in her chest that she could not name. She pressed her lips together and held it back with everything she had, because she could not fall apart in this man's kitchen in front of her children. "Sit down," Jedediah said, without turning around. "It will not take long. That is beans from last night, still warm. Bacon will be a few minutes." Daniel, who had been rigid with the careful pride of a boy who understood more than anyone wanted him to, crossed to the table and sat down with the precise movements of someone trying very hard to be polite and not let anyone see how hungry he was. Aliner had already leaned toward the table with her whole body before Marcella set her in the chair, and Marcella sat beside her and kept her hands flat on the table, kept herself still, kept herself from shaking by sheer will. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "No need," he said. He brought the beans first, ladling them into the plates with a matter-of-fact generosity that was more dignified than any elaborate gesture of charity she had ever witnessed, because it carried no weight of condescension, no implication that they should feel grateful to him specifically rather than simply warm and fed, which was all anyone actually needed. He brought the bacon when it was done, and he brought cornbread that he had apparently already had on the counter under a cloth, and he poured coffee for himself and for Marcella without asking, and he set a cup of warmed milk in front of each child with the same quiet efficiency. He sat down at the head of the table with his own plate and ate with the unhurried manner of a man at peace in his own home, and for a while nobody said anything at all, and that silence was one of the most merciful silences Marcella had ever sat inside. It was Daniel who spoke first, because Daniel at 8 years old was still young enough that curiosity sometimes overrode his learned self-containment. "Are you a rancher?" Daniel asked. "I am," Jedediah said. "Do you have horses?" "I do." 11 of them. Daniel's eyes went wide with a reverence that was perfectly appropriate, because in New Mexico territory in 1878, 11 horses was a significant thing. "What kind?" "Mostly quarter horses." "2 Mustangs I broke last spring." He looked at the boy with an attention that was direct but not intrusive. "You like horses?" "Yes, sir," Daniel said. "My father had a horse named Bishop. He was a bay." There was a small silence after that, and Marcella looked at her son, at the way his jaw tightened briefly before he returned to his food, and she felt the familiar ache of watching her children carry grief in their small bodies. "Good name for a horse," Jedediah said simply, and went back to his food and did not press further, and Marcella thought that was exactly the right thing to do. When the plates were empty, and Aliner had eaten with the focused intensity of a child making up for lost time, and Daniel had eaten with a more careful dignity that did not disguise the fact that he had eaten every last crumb, Jedediah got up and began to pour more coffee, and Marcella stood up to help clear the table. "Sit," he said. "I would rather be useful," she said. He turned and looked at her then, really looked at her, and she looked back, and there was a brief moment of 2 wills meeting and taking each other's measure. He was a man used to being in charge of his own space, she could see that. And she was a woman who had spent 4 months keeping a farm and 2 children alive on her own after her husband died, which meant she was not accustomed to being told to sit when there was work to be done. "The children can sit," she said, and began stacking plates. He watched her for a moment and then gave a small nod and handed her the pot to carry to the wash basin, and they cleaned up the kitchen together in a companionable efficiency that felt unexpectedly natural, as if they had done this before, as if the kitchen itself recognized the arrangement. Alina fell asleep in her chair before the dishes were done, her head tipped sideways against her folded arms on the table, her small chest rising and falling with the deep peace of a child who has been warm and fed. Daniel lasted a few minutes longer, fighting sleep with the stubbornness of a boy who wanted to stay awake for whatever came next, but eventually his head began to dip and Jedediah looked at him and said, "There is a spare room off the hall. Go ahead." Daniel looked at his mother, and Marcella nodded, and Daniel stood up with careful dignity and walked toward the hall, and Jedediah carried Alina without any ceremony or apparent effort, the child barely stirring, and laid her on the narrow bed beside her brother and draped a quilt over both of them. He came back to the kitchen, and Marcella was standing by the wash basin with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that was doing something profound for the warmth she had been missing for 3 days, and they regarded each other across the kitchen in the growing gray light of the November morning pressing at the window. "My name is Marcella Barrett," she said. "I am a widow. My husband Thomas died in July. The bank is taking our land." She paused. "I am not telling you that to ask for more than you have already given me. I am telling you because you deserve to know who you let into your house." He studied her. "I know who you let into your house when you let them in. You let in a woman with 2 hungry children and enough pride to make the asking hard." He set his coffee cup down on the counter. "My name is Jedediah Finley. I have a ranch to run and I could use capable hands. I am short a cook since my last one left for Silver City in September, and the men are eating my poor attempts at biscuits, which nobody deserves." Marcella looked at him. The morning light was filling the kitchen now, the pale gold gray of early winter coming through the window and falling across the table where her children had just eaten the first real meal they'd had in days. "Are you offering me work?" she asked. "I am," he said. "In exchange for what?" "In exchange for cooking," he said, "and whatever else needs doing around the house. Room and board for you and the children, a fair wage, nothing more and nothing less." She was quiet for a moment, turning the offer over in her mind with the careful thoroughness of a woman who had learned that arrangements which seemed straightforward sometimes were not, and he waited without pushing, without adding anything, which she recognized as patience and also as a kind of respect. "I am a good cook," she said, "and I am not afraid of work." "I can see that," he said. "The children will not be in your way." "They are already not in my way." She took a breath. "All right," she said. "Yes." "Thank you," he nodded once, brisk and decided. "There is a room at the back of the house that is empty. You and the children can have it while we see how things work." The room was small, but it was warm, and it had a real floor and a window that faced east, which meant the morning light came in early and lay across the floor in long gold rectangles that Alina discovered within the first hour of waking, and chased with her fingers as if the light were a living thing. There were 2 narrow beds, and Marcella dragged one close to the wall so Alina would not roll off, and watched her children wake up slowly in a warm room with full bellies, and she sat on the edge of her own bed and pressed her hands against her knees and breathed. She had made it. She did not know what came next, but she had made it to a place where there was warmth and food and a door that locked, and for the moment, that was enough. The ranch hands were 5 men, and they regarded Marcella Barrett with varying degrees of curiosity when she appeared in the cookhouse that first morning, but none of them were unkind. The oldest was a man called Hazel, which was a nickname whose origin he refused to explain, a weathered man of about 50, with the careful courtliness of someone raised to tip his hat and mean it. The youngest was a boy named Webb, 19 years old and desperately self-conscious about it, who turned so red when Marcella said good morning that even Hazel laughed. The others were Cole and Francisco, and a quiet man they called Dutch who barely spoke, but did his work with a steady thoroughness that Marcella came to respect deeply. Francisco was from a family that had been in the territory since before the Americans arrived, and he told Marcella this on the second day with the particular directness of someone who had learned to establish facts before assumptions could take root. Marcella said that made him more a native than most people she had ever met, and Francisco looked at her with something that shifted from defensive to genuinely surprised, and after that they got on extremely well. Marcella cooked. She cooked the way she had always cooked, which was to say with the precise and unfussy competence of a woman who had fed a family on limited resources for years, and had learned that food, really good food, was a form of love that asked nothing in return. She made biscuits that had Hazel actually closing his eyes when he took the first bite. She made red chili stew with venison that Cole said was the best thing he had put in his mouth since he was in Texas. She made pan bread and dried apple cake and beans cooked slow with fatback and garlic, and on the third morning she made a proper breakfast of eggs and bacon and fried potatoes, and the 5 ranch hands sat at the long table in the cookhouse and ate with a reverence that was almost religious. Jedediah ate with his men in the mornings always. He was not the kind of employer who separated himself from the people who worked for him, which Marcella noted and filed away as information. He sat at the table the same as everyone else and ate the same food and talked about the same things, the cattle and the weather and the state of the north fence, and sometimes he told a dry, quiet story that made the men laugh, and sometimes he just listened. He watched Marcella work. She became aware of this gradually, in the way you become aware of warmth coming from a direction without being certain of its source. He did not stare. It was not intrusive or uncomfortable. It was more the quality of attention a careful man gives to things he is trying to understand, the way he might watch a horse moving in a field, not to judge it but to know it. She watched him too. She would have been dishonest with herself if she pretended otherwise. He worked as hard as any of his men, harder than some. He was in the barn before anyone else in the mornings, and he did not stop until the day was done, and even then he sat at his desk in the evenings going over the accounts and the correspondence with the focused diligence of someone who understood that a ranch did not run itself on good intentions. He was not a frivolous man. He was not a soft man. But there was a consideration about him, a thoughtfulness in the way he moved through the world, that Marcella found herself thinking about in the evening when the children were asleep and the house was quiet. On the 5th day, he knocked on the door of the room at the back of the house in the early evening, and Marcella opened it to find him holding a slightly battered book. "I noticed the boy reads," he said. "I saw him looking at the spines in the sitting room. This one is probably more his speed than the others." It was a collection of adventure stories, the kind with illustrations, and it had clearly been read many times by someone who had loved it. Marcella looked at the book and then up at him. "It was mine," he said, "when I was about his age." He said it without any particular sentiment, just factually, as if he were identifying the origins of a fence post. Marcella took the book and said thank you, and he nodded and went back down the hall, and she stood in the doorway for a moment holding the warm and battered book of someone else's boyhood, and felt something stir in her chest that she was not ready to name. Daniel read the entire book in 4 days, and then asked Jedediah very politely if he could read it again. And Jedediah said he could keep it, and Daniel held the book the way children hold things they know are precious, with both hands and close to the body. The weeks moved through November and into December, and the ranch settled into a rhythm that included Marcella and her children as naturally as if they had always been part of it. Eleanor followed Hazel around the property with the absolute dedication of a devoted shadow, and Hazel bore this with a combination of gruff dignity and obvious delight that nobody mentioned because to mention it would have embarrassed him. Daniel began helping with small chores in the barn, carrying water and sweeping, because he could not stand to be idle when other people were working, and because he was drawn to the horses with a pull that was almost gravitational. Jedediah did not ask Daniel to work. He simply did not stop him when Daniel appeared in the barn with his sleeves pushed up and his serious 8-year-old face fixed with intent. He showed him things without making a lesson of it, just explaining what he was doing as he was doing it, and Daniel absorbed it all with the quiet hunger of a boy who was trying to figure out how the world worked. It was Hazel who mentioned it to Marcella, leaning against the cookhouse doorframe one afternoon with his coffee, saying, "That boy of yours is going to know more about horses than God before spring." "He always loved them," Marcella said. "He's good with them," Hazel said, and nodded toward the barn where through the open door they could see Daniel standing at the stall of the gentler of the two Mustangs, completely still, letting the horse sniff his outstretched hand. "Finley's been watching him work with Copper there for 3 days. He doesn't let just anyone near that horse." Marcella looked at the barn doorway and then said, carefully, "He's a good man." Hazel looked at her with eyes that had seen a great deal and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. December in the New Mexico territory was not forgiving, but the ranch was well built and well provisioned, and there was wood enough for the fires and food enough for everyone, and Marcella found herself, for the first time since Thomas had died, not afraid. Not free from worry, because worry was a permanent condition of motherhood and poverty and widowhood, but not afraid in the specific bone-deep way she had been afraid when the food ran out and the nights were cold and the options were gone. There was an evening in the middle of December when she and Jedediah were both in the kitchen after supper, he at the table with his accounts and she mending a pair of Daniel's trousers by the lamp, and the children were in bed, and the house was settled into its nighttime quiet, and they sat like that for a long time without any conversation, and it was the most comfortable silence Marcella had known in months. Eventually she looked up from her mending and he was looking at her, and for a moment neither of them looked away. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Why did you open the door that morning? A strange woman knocking at your back door before dawn. Most men would have been suspicious, some would have been hostile." He considered this, turning his pencil between his fingers in a slow, thoughtful rotation. "Because you knocked quietly," he said finally. "Desperation knocks loud, fear knocks loud. You knocked like you were sorry to disturb me, which told me you were not someone I needed to be afraid of." She looked at him for a moment. "That is a very precise way of reading a knock on a door. I have been the man on the other side of desperation's knocking before," he said. "I know what it sounds like." She did not ask him to explain that, because the way he said it closed the door on further questions gently but clearly, and she respected it. But she held it, that information, the knowledge that he had known hard times himself, that the solidity of what he had built was not inherited ease, but something he had constructed from the same raw material of necessity that she was working with now. "Your children are good people," he said, and the abruptness of the change of subject and the sincerity with which he said it simultaneously surprised and undid her. "They are," she managed. "Daniel is going to be an exceptional horseman," he said. "He has the temperament for it, patient and quiet and curious without being reckless." He paused. "And a leaner is going to be trouble in the best possible way." Marcella laughed, actually laughed at the precision of that assessment, because a leaner at 6 was already demonstrating a fearless creativity that oscillated between delight and chaos, and hearing it named so accurately by a man who had known her child for 3 weeks was startling in its intimacy. "She really is," Marcella said. He smiled, not a broad smile but a real one, the kind that changed the whole shape of a face, and Marcella thought that she was in a great deal of trouble. Christmas came to the Finley ranch with a quiet warmth that Marcella would remember for the rest of her life. She had been worried about it, the way mothers worry about holidays when there is nothing to give, but she had made things with her hands, a carved wooden horse for Daniel that she worked on by lamplight after the children slept, using a pocket knife and a block of soft pine that Hazel had quietly left on the kitchen counter one day without comment, and a cloth doll with button eyes for a leaner, dressed in a scrap of calico that she had found in the mending basket. Small things, but hers. On Christmas morning, she came to the kitchen to find that Jedediah had been in the sitting room before anyone else was awake, and there was a small pine tree in the corner decorated with strips of red cloth and dried berries, and under it were two wrapped parcels. A book on horses for Daniel, a real proper book with illustrations, and for Alina, a small porcelain-faced doll that was a finer thing than anything Marcella could have managed, with real hair and a painted smile. Alina walked into the sitting room half asleep and saw the doll and stopped walking entirely. She stood still for 3 full seconds and then made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a word, and crossed the room in a dead run, and gathered the doll to her chest, and held it the way a person holds something they cannot believe is real. Marcella looked at Jedediah, who was standing by the window with his coffee, watching Alina with that same still amber-eyed attention he gave to most things, and she had to look away before the feeling in her chest made it to her face. He came to stand beside her and handed her a cup of coffee, and she took it, and their fingers brushed in the passing, and neither of them moved quickly away. And the kitchen was warm and the children were happy, and outside the window the desert was white with frost, and the sky was the pale luminous blue that came after a clear cold night. And Marcella thought that she needed to be very careful because she was in danger of wanting things she had not planned to want again. January arrived with a seriousness of purpose that the desert winter reserved for its harshest demonstrations. 3 days of wind that cut like glass and froze the water in the horse trough overnight, and kept everyone inside as much as was practical. During those 3 days, the ranch house became a domestic world unto itself, the men coming in from necessary outdoor work with red faces and stiff hands, warming themselves at the stove, while Marcella fed them hot food at regular intervals. On the second day of the cold spell, she found Jedediah at the kitchen table with a ledger and a letter, and an expression she had not seen on him before, which was something close to worry. He looked up when she came in, and the expression shifted to neutral with a speed that told her the shift was deliberate. "What is it?" she asked, because she had learned by now that directness was how he preferred to communicate, and she had adapted accordingly. He was quiet for a moment, weighing something. Then he said, "Cattle prices are lower than projected. I had counted on a certain figure from the fall drive, and the figure came in below it." He looked at the ledger. "It is manageable. I am not in trouble. But it means some things I had planned for spring will wait." She sat down across from him. "Is the ranch secure?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "The men's wages are secure. The operation is sound." He paused. "Your position is secure. That is not what this is." She realized he had said that deliberately to address what she might be worried about, and the consideration of it touched her. "Then what is it?" she said. He rubbed the back of his neck, and the gesture was such a human thing, such a crack in the composed surface he usually presented, that she found herself leaning slightly forward. "I had planned to expand," he said, "buy the Harcastle acreage to the north. It has been sitting empty for 2 years, and it is good land. I thought by spring the finances would be in the right place." He closed the ledger. "It will wait. Could someone else buy it?" she asked. "They could," he said. "A man named Carver has been looking at it. He runs cattle out of the South Valley, and he is not a bad man, but that land should come to this ranch. It would nearly double our summer grazing." He looked at her directly. "But these are my problems, not yours. I apologize for saying it out loud." "Do not apologize," she said immediately. "I would rather know how things actually stand than live in a house where real things go unsaid." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened by a degree that was subtle but that she caught because she had been paying attention. "Your husband was not that way," he said carefully. She thought about it honestly. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "He was kind and he loved us, but he protected me from the real state of things in a way that he thought was kindness." She kept her voice even. "I only knew the full extent of the debt when the bank's man came with the letter. If I had known earlier, I might have been able to do something." Jedediah was quiet. Then he said, "I think that is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a long time." "I have had to become practical," she said. "There is nothing wrong with being practical," he said. And then, after a pause, with a different quality in his voice, quieter and more deliberate, "There is also nothing wrong with being more than practical, when you allow it." She met his eyes and held them for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, and the kitchen was very still. "You should eat," she said finally, standing up and going to the stove, because if she sat across from him looking at him with that particular expression in those amber eyes, she was going to do or say something irrevocable. "You always do that," he said, and she could hear the faint trace of amusement in it. "Do what?" she asked. "Find a practical thing to do when the conversation gets close to something real." She kept her back to him and stirred the pot on the stove. "I am heating up soup," she said. "Yes, you are," he said, and she could hear him smiling. In February, a man came to the ranch. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when the cold had broken slightly, and the sun was making its presence known again over the ridgeline. And his name was Victor Crane, and he was related by some degree to the family that had set their dog on Marcella in November, which she noted with a small private satisfaction. Victor Crane was in his mid-40s, broad and loud in the manner of men who mistake volume for authority, and he had a letter from the bank in Silver City that he wanted Jedediah to look at regarding the Hardcastle land. Marcella was at the kitchen window when Crane arrived, and she watched the conversation in the yard. Jedediah's posture was easy and neutral, the way it was when he was being careful, and Crane was doing most of the talking. And eventually Crane handed Jedediah the letter, and Jedediah read it without expression and handed it back. Crane seemed to be making an offer or a proposition of some kind, and Jedediah's response was brief and final, and Crane left. She had the soup on when Jedediah came inside, pulling off his coat and hanging it on the hook by the door with a deliberateness that told her he was containing something. "What did he want?" she asked. "He wants to form a partnership on the Hardcastle land," Jedediah said. "Split the cost and the use." He washed his hands at the basin. "I said no." "Why?" "Because a partnership with Victor Crane would mean Victor Crane having a say in how this ranch operates," he said, "and that is not something I am prepared to allow." She set a bowl of soup on the table. "Then how will you get the land?" He sat down and picked up the spoon. "I have been thinking about that," he said. He took a bite of the soup and stopped. "Marcella, this is extraordinary." "It is just soup," she said. "It is not just soup," he said, with a gravity that was so disproportionate to the subject that she laughed, and he looked up at her laugh with an expression so open and unguarded that the laugh died on her lips, and they looked at each other across the table with a directness that had nothing to do with soup or land. "Jedediah," she said, and his name felt different in her mouth than it had before, more deliberate. "I know," he said very quietly. "I do not want to complicate your life," she said. "I came to your door with nothing, and you gave me a place and a wage and—" "Stop," he said. "Do not make what you are to me about what you came with." She was very still. "What I am to you," she said, not a question exactly, but not a statement either. He set the spoon down. He looked at her with the direct and steady attention he gave to things that mattered, and he said, "You are the most capable and honest woman I have ever known. You are a remarkable mother. You make this house feel like something it did not feel like before." He paused. "And I have been trying to be respectful of the fact that you are a widow who has been through hard things, and that you are in a situation where you might feel obligated in a way that—" "Stop," she said, echoing his own word back at him. He stopped. "I am not obligated," she said. "I am employed. There is a difference, and you have kept it a difference, and I am aware of that, and it matters to me." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with what I owe you, because I do not think of it as owing. I think of it as—" She stopped, looked at the table, looked back up at him. "I think of it as finding something I did not think I would find again." The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had ever sat inside. Then Jedediah Finley stood up from the table and came around it and stood in front of her, and she stood up too, because she was not the kind of woman who stayed seated when something important was happening, and he put his hand along the side of her face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with how large his hands were, and she put her hand over his hand and held it there. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow it." She looked up at him, and the amber warmth in his eyes was right there, open and clear, and she thought about the woman who had walked across frozen ground in the dark 4 months ago with nothing in her hands and nothing left to lose, and she thought about what it meant to be found in the dark by warmth. "Yes," she said, "I will allow it." He was a thorough and earnest man, and he courted her in the way that suited him, which was to say with a consistency and attentiveness that was not showy but was entirely present. He brought her things he noticed she needed before she asked. A better pair of boots because he had seen her favoring her foot in the cold. A new length of blue calico because he had noticed she always wore the same 2 dresses. He asked her questions about her life and her opinions and her childhood, and he listened to the answers with complete attention, the kind that made her feel that what she said was being genuinely received and held. He told her things, too, in the gradual way of a private man slowly choosing trust. He had grown up poor in Tennessee, the second of 4 children on a hardscrabble farm. He had come west at 18 with $12 and a determination that had no particular shape, yet beyond the need to make something. He had worked cattle drives in Texas and drifted through 2 other territories and ended up in New Mexico, because the land felt right in a way he could not entirely explain, except to say that it answered something in him. He had been in love once before, a woman named Clara who had chosen to go back east rather than stay in the territory, and he had understood her decision and forgiven it without bitterness, but it had made him careful in a way that took years to examine. "Are you still careful?" Marcella asked him one evening in March when they were sitting on the back porch in the first genuinely warm evening of the approaching spring, the stars coming out above the ridgeline with the particular brilliance of a desert sky. "I am," he said, "but careful is not the same as closed." "No," she agreed, "it is not." He reached over and took her hand where it lay on the arm of her chair, and held it, and they sat in the warm evening air with the stars coming down over the desert, and Marcella felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. She told him about Thomas in March, the real Thomas, not the summary version she had given on that first morning, but the full and complicated truth of a marriage that had been real and loving and imperfect, and ultimately insufficient in its protections. She told him about the debts and the broken promises that Thomas had made to himself as much as anyone, the plans that never arrived, the way she had loved him honestly and watched him struggle honestly, and buried him with an honest grief that she had not allowed herself to fully feel because there were children to feed. Jedediah listened to all of it without interruption, and when she was done he said, "You have been carrying that alone for a long time." "Yes," she said. "You do not have to any more," he said, simply without any drama or declaration, just that fact. She looked at him in the early spring evening and thought that this was what she had not known she was looking for, not someone to rescue her, because she had managed the rescuing herself, but someone to stand beside her and carry the weight at the same shoulder height. In April, the question of the Hardcastle land resolved itself in an unexpected direction. The bank in Silver City, dealing with the complications of the post-Reconstruction economy that was pressing in from the east and changing the financial landscape of even the remote territories, offered the land at a reduced price to facilitate a quick sale. Jedediah saw the letter and spent 2 days quietly calculating, and on the 3rd day he told Marcella over breakfast that he thought he could do it if he was careful. "I have savings I have not touched," he said. "And I have a steer I have been holding back from sale because I thought I would breed from him, but his line is not producing what I hoped." He looked at the figures in his notebook. "If I sell him in Santa Fe and combine that with what I have set aside, how much short are you?" she asked. He told her the figure. It was not large. It was the kind of figure that was not nothing but was not impossible. "I have some money," she said. He looked up. "From my wages," she said. "I have not spent much. Room and board are covered and the children need very little. I have been saving because I did not know what I was saving for, but I knew I should. She looked at him steadily. It is not the full difference, but it is close. Marcella, it is not charity, she said before he could protest. You offered me a wage and I earned it. I am offering to invest what I earned in a venture that I am living alongside. That is a business arrangement. He looked at her for a long moment. The amber eyes were doing that thing they did when he was thinking deeply, a quality of focused internal examination that she had come to recognize and be fond of. It would be a loan, he said finally, with proper interest. Jedediah, she said, with proper interest, he repeated firmly, or we do not do it. Fine, she said, with proper interest. He nodded, and then the corner of his mouth moved in that small, contained smile that was his version of a grin, and she thought that this was a man she could make a life with, a real and solid life built on honest ground. The Harcastle land was bought in May, and it doubled the summer grazing, and it was good land, red-earthed and juniper-studded, with a spring-fed creek running through the lower pasture that Jedediah had known about but had not said aloud to anyone, because information is only valuable when kept close until you are ready to use it. They rode out to look at it together on the day the papers were signed, just the two of them, and stood on a high point above the new acreage and looked out over the land in the late afternoon light. It is beautiful, Marcella said. It is, he agreed, and she knew he was not only looking at the land. He asked her to marry him in June, on a Sunday evening after supper. In the garden she had started at the east side of the house where the morning light was best, kneeling down in the red dirt with his hat in his hand, and his amber eyes entirely open, no reserve, no careful surface, just the man underneath it saying what was true. She said yes before he had finished the question. He laughed, a real full laugh that she had not heard from him before, and stood up and picked her up off the ground in a manner that made her gasp and then laugh too, and he held her and she held him back, and the garden caught the last of the June light, and the evening smelled of juniper and good earth. They were married in July, at the small church in Clayfield, by a minister named Reverend Oakes who took his work seriously and made the words feel real. The ranch hands were all there, Hazel in a clean shirt that clearly pained him by its cleanliness but that he wore with rigid dignity, Webb turning red again and unable to stop grinning, Cole and Francisco and Dutch in their Sunday best, which in Francisco's case included an embroidered vest that was the finest garment in the building. Mrs. Hooper from the dry goods store was there, having softened her assessments considerably over the months as Marcella had become a known and respected presence in Clayfield, and she sat in the second row and dabbed at her eyes during the vows, which nobody mentioned afterward. Daniel stood beside Jedediah as his witness, serious and straight, wearing the shirt that Marcella had made him and holding the ring with both hands until the moment it was needed, and Alina sat in the front pew between two of Francisco's cousins who had come for the event, holding her porcelain doll, and occasionally turning to share a highly personal commentary on the proceedings with the doll as if it could hear her. Marcella wore a dress of deep blue that she had sewn herself, cutting it from a length of fabric that Jedediah had brought back from Santa Fe with the straightforward declaration that blue suited her, which was not a romantic statement exactly, but was, she had come to understand, exactly how Jedediah Finley said romantic things. Her hair was pinned up with a pair of combs that had been her mother's, the only jewelry she owned and more precious to her than any other object in the world. She walked down the aisle of that small church on her own 2 feet, because there was no father or brother to give her away, and she did not think she needed giving. She had come to this marriage on her own terms, from her own choosing, and she walked toward Jedediah Finley with the straight-backed clarity of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. He was waiting for her at the altar, and when she came to stand beside him, he looked at her with those amber eyes and said, quietly, so only she could hear, "There you are," 2 words, and she felt them in every part of her. The summer after the wedding was the best of Marcella's adult life. Not because it was easy, the ranch was work, always and entirely work, and the expanded acreage meant more of it, and the children had opinions about everything, and the Texas summer heat pressed down on the territory with its usual conviction. But because she was happy in the specific and thorough way that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of the right person to meet it with, she and Jedediah developed their own language, the shorthand of people who are becoming deeply known to each other, a way of communicating in few words because many were not needed. She could read his moods from the way he came through the kitchen door, and he could tell from the particular way she was standing at the stove whether she was content or worried, or in need of being talked to, or in need of being left to think. And they accommodated each other in these things without negotiation, because attention had made accommodation natural. Daniel, by August, could ride well enough that Jedediah put him on the gentler of the two Mustangs, the one called Copper, under supervision. And Daniel sat that horse with a quiet joy that was almost transcendent and looked at Jedediah afterward with an expression that contained gratitude too large for 8-year-old words. Jedediah gave his shoulder a brief, solid squeeze that said everything. Eleanor had attached herself to Hazel with the permanent and unconditional affection of a child who has identified a person of quality, and Hazel had given up pretending this was anything other than the great delight of his current existence. He taught her the names of the stars, a project that had begun with Eleanor pointing at the sky and demanding information, and that had expanded into a nightly ritual when the weather permitted. The old ranch hand, and the 6-year-old sitting on the back fence counting stars, and Hazel saying their names with the gravity of a professor. In September, Marcella realized she was expecting a child. She told Jedediah on a Thursday evening in the kitchen, direct and simple as was her way, and he sat very still for a moment in the way he did when receiving information that was changing the shape of things inside him. Then he stood up and came around the table and held her face in his large hands and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, entirely unguarded, all the warmth in him right at the surface. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was different, lower. "Yes," she said, "very well." He rested his forehead against hers and they stood in the kitchen for a long time without speaking. "A boy," he said after a while. "You cannot know that yet," she said. "I think it will be a boy," he said. "I am prepared to be wrong." He was not wrong. The baby came in May of 1880, a boy, strong and loud and decisive about his opinions from the first hour of his life. They named him Samuel Thomas Finley, the Thomas for the man who had been Marcella's husband and Daniel and Eleanor's father, because Jedediah said that a name is a way of keeping someone present, and Thomas Barrett had been a man who loved his family even if he had not known how to protect them, and that love deserved acknowledgement. Daniel, who had been a child carrying grief like a stone in his chest for nearly 2 years, held the baby, and the stone seemed to lighten by a degree that was visible to Marcella, watching her son hold his brother with the careful reverence of a boy who understood he was holding something irreplaceable. "He looks like you, Mama," Daniel said. "He looks like a potato," Eleanor said, and then looked around to see who would correct her and found nobody willing to argue the point because newborns do, in fact, often look like potatoes, and she gave a satisfied nod. Jedediah took the baby from Daniel and held him with the slightly stunned and deeply devoted expression of a man encountering the specific miracle of his own child for the first time, and he sat in the chair by the window and talked to Samuel in a low voice, very quietly, just the two of them. And Marcella watched her husband hold his son and thought about November of 1878, about frozen ground and a dark sky and a light in a window, about 3 soft knocks on a stranger's door. The ranch grew into itself over the following years. The Harcastle acreage became the north pasture and produced well, and the creek proved as valuable as Jedediah had known it would be, and he hired 2 more men in 1881 when the cattle numbers justified it. Marcella took on the management of the ranch accounts alongside her work in the house, because she had a clear head for numbers, and because Jedediah recognized this and said so plainly, and gave her the ledgers without any hesitation or performance of reluctance, which she loved him for. The town of Clayfield grew too, the way frontier towns grew in the early 1880s with the expansion of the railroad southward through the territory and the influx of settlers that came with it. New families and new businesses and the complicated, and not always comfortable changes that growth brought. Marcella was involved in the establishment of a proper school, an effort she led with the same practical tenacity she brought to everything, writing letters to the Territorial Education Office and organizing meetings, and eventually securing both a building and a teacher. A young woman named Miss Paradine, who arrived from Ohio with crates of books, and an enthusiasm that the territory received with varying degrees of welcome. Daniel started at the school and found in Miss Paradine's books a second love to sit beside his love of horses. He read with the same focused passion he brought to everything, and he was 12 years old when he finished every book in the school's collection, and Jedediah wrote to a bookseller in Santa Fe and ordered more. Alina attended school with a social confidence that made her teacher's life intermittently chaotic and entirely interesting. Samuel grew from baby to toddler to small boy with a personality that was its own complete and unignorable phenomenon, opinionated and charming in equal measure, with his father's amber eyes and his mother's directness, and a laugh that could fill a room. He followed Jedediah everywhere, from the time he could walk, with the dedicated urgency of a very small and very serious ranch hand, and Jedediah accommodated this with a patience that was one of the great demonstrations of his character, crouching down to explain things, lifting Samuel up to see over fences, giving him a child-sized task in every adult activity. In the spring of 1883, Marcella found herself expecting again. This time she told him over breakfast, and he put his coffee cup down and looked at her across the table with the smile she loved best, the quiet full one that was just his, and he said, "Alina will be insufferable about this." "She is already insufferable about most things," Marcella said fondly. "It is one of her finest qualities." "She will insist on naming it," he said. "She will absolutely insist on naming it," Marcella agreed. "We should get our preferences in very early." The second child of their marriage was a girl, born in December of 1883, with a lot of hair and very definite opinions about the immediate situation. And Alina, who had been lobbying since September for the name Rose, received this girl with the possessive delight of a child given the greatest gift of her life. The baby was named Rose Clarita Finley, the Clarita from Francisco's grandmother, because Francisco had become in the years of the ranches growing something between an employee and a family member, and the gesture of the name was one he received with a quiet dignity that Marcella recognized as the holding back of something larger. Hazel took one look at baby Rose and declared that she was the finest thing he had ever seen, which he had also said about Samuel and about Daniel's writing and about Marcella's apple cake, but which he clearly meant each time. Webb, who was no longer the boy who turned red at everything, but was a young man of 23 who had grown into his own considerable competence under Jedediah's employment, bought the baby a wooden rattle from the store in Clayfield, painted blue, and presented it with the earnest awkwardness of a man who is not yet practiced at sentimental gestures, but intends to be. Clayfield in 1884 was a different place than it had been in 1878. The railroad connection had changed things substantially, bringing goods and people and the specific complications that came with each. There was a proper Main Street now with a hotel and 2 restaurants and a newspaper office that printed a weekly paper, and the old rough frontier informality was giving way to something more structured, not always for better. The injustices of the territory were more visible in the town than they had been in the relative isolation of the ranch. The ways that the Mexican families who had been there for generations were treated by newly arrived Anglo settlers, the diminishing rights and lands of the Apache bands to the south, the complicated and not gentle process of the territory becoming more formally American. Jedediah and Marcella talked about these things in their evenings, seriously, and without the comfortable dismissals that many of their neighbors preferred. Francisco had spoken to Jedediah about specific incidents in town, treatment he had received, and that members of his family had received, and Jedediah had gone into town and had a number of conversations with a number of people that were quiet and firm, and that Marcella had heard about secondhand with a satisfaction that was one of the things she loved about him. The way his sense of fairness was not theoretical but practical. When the new school needed a replacement teacher the following year, after Miss Paradine married and moved to Albuquerque, Marcella wrote the letter of recommendation for a candidate she had identified herself, a man of mixed Anglo and Mexican heritage named Mr. Sandoval, who was the best-educated person she had met in the territory, and who had been told by the previous school board that his candidacy was not appropriate. The letter she wrote to the Territorial Education Office was 4 pages long and contained every argument she had, and she signed it with her full name, Marcella Barrett Finley. Mr. Sandoval got the position and taught in Clayfield for 12 years. In the evenings of 1884 and into 1885, when the children were in bed and the ranch was settled, and the stars were doing their magnificent work over the desert sky, Marcella and Jedediah often sat on the back porch in the chairs they had placed there for this purpose, close enough that her shoulder could rest against his if she leaned slightly, which she usually did. They talked or they did not talk, and both were good. She thought sometimes about the particular mathematics of how a life is assembled from its disasters and its small decisions. She thought about Thomas, who she had loved and missed with a genuine and permanent grief that did not contradict her love for the man beside her but sat beside it, the way 2 true things can occupy the same space. She thought about the letter from the bank and the frozen ground in the dark before dawn of November 1878 and the 3 knocks on a door that had changed everything. "What would you have done," she said one evening, "if you had not opened the door?" Jedediah turned to look at her. He was 41 now, and there was gray at his temples that had appeared in the last year, and that she found she was helplessly fond of, the way she was helplessly fond of most things about him. "I always opened the door," he said. "You could not have known that would be me on the other side." "No," he said, "but whoever was on the other side knocking like that quietly before dawn was someone who needed the door opened." He looked at the stars for a moment. "And I have been the person who needed a door opened, so." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. "Besides," he said, "if I had not opened it I would have spent the rest of my life not knowing you. Which is not a life I would have wanted to live, even if I did not know what I was missing." She lifted her head and looked at him. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said." "Do not tell the men," he said. "It will ruin me." She laughed, and he held her tighter, and the stars were very bright over the desert. Daniel turned 15 in 1885 and was by then a horseman of genuine and notable skill, the kind that other ranchers in the territory had begun to remark upon. Jedediah had given him a horse of his own the previous year, a young gray quarter horse with a broad chest and good sense, and Daniel had named him Bishop, without ceremony, as if there had never been any question of any other name. He rode Bishop every day in the early morning before school, in the meadow east of the north pasture, and sometimes in the evenings Marcella could see them from the kitchen window, boy and horse moving through the long light of the late afternoon, with the particular harmony of 2 things that belonged together. Eleanor at 13 was a force entirely unto herself, brilliant and opinionated and deeply invested in justice as a personal concern. She had absorbed Miss Paradine's books and Mr. Sandoval's teaching and her mother's practicality and her stepfather's quiet steadiness into something that was entirely her own, a person who knew what she thought and was not afraid to say it, which produced regular educational debates at the Finley dinner table that Jedediah sometimes refereed, and more often simply watched with the amber-eyed attention of a man in the presence of something exceptional. He loved those children. All four of them, the two who had come to him wrapped in threadbare shawls and hunger, and the two who had come from the particular love of a marriage built on genuine ground. He loved them in the specific and practical way he loved all things he valued, with attention and consistency, and the deep reliability of a man who understood that love was not a feeling you declared, but a thing you did, every day in the choices you made. Marcella knew this. She knew it in the way she knew the weight of his arm across her shoulders, and the sound of his voice in the early morning, and the specific quality of his attention when he thought she might be troubled. She knew it the way you know a thing that has become so integrated into the fabric of your daily life that removing it would not just create a gap, but would require you to be rebuilt from the beginning. Samuel, at 5 years old, had developed the complete conviction that he was going to be a rancher, specifically the greatest rancher in the New Mexico territory, specifically better than his father, which he announced with a frequency and directness that made Jedediah's mouth work very hard at remaining straight. He wore a child-size hat that Hazel had made for him by cutting down an old one, and he considered this hat to be the most important piece of equipment in his possession, and treated it accordingly. Rose, at 18 months, had opinions about everything and expressed them at full volume, and was the unquestioned monarch of any room she entered. Alina managed her sister with the efficient affection of a person who recognizes a kindred spirit, and Samuel regarded her with the wary respect of someone who understands they are not, in fact, the most powerful personality in the house. Christmas of 1885 was full and warm, the house smelling of pine and fresh bread, and the particular spiced smell of the apple cake that Marcella made every year, because it was now so thoroughly associated with celebration that she could not imagine the holiday without it. All 5 ranch hands came for Christmas dinner, Hazel and Webb and Cole and Francisco and Dutch. And Francisco brought his mother and 2 sisters and his eldest nephew, who was 8 years old, and regarded the entire occasion with the wide-eyed appetite of a child for whom everything is new and wonderful. The table was extended with a board that Jedediah had added for the purpose, and there was roast beef and cornbread, and red chili and potatoes, and pickled vegetables that Marcella had put up in October, and the apple cake. And Hazel gave a toast that was gruff and short, and managed in 4 sentences to say something true and large about the particular quality of what had been built in this place. And Francisco translated the important parts for his mother, who received them with a nod of the satisfied dignity of a woman who has been around long enough to recognize genuine things. After the children were in bed and the guests had gone and the kitchen was clean, Marcella and Jedediah sat together in the sitting room in the quiet, the lamp turned low, the fire in the fireplace doing its warm and comfortable work. 7 years, she said. He looked at her. 7 years since November of 1878, she said. More or less. More or less, he agreed. I have been thinking about that walk across your yard, she said. In the dark, with the frost on the ground. He looked at her steadily. I was so afraid, she said. Not of you specifically. I did not know enough about you to be afraid of you, afraid of the asking, afraid that even the asking would not be enough. She looked at the fire. I think about that woman sometimes, walking across the dark yard with nothing in her hands. She had everything in her hands, Jedediah said quietly. She had her children and her honesty and more courage than she knew. Marcella looked at him. She knocked on my door and told me the truth, he said. That is not nothing, that is a great deal. His eyes were warm in the firelight. It is, in fact, everything. She moved across the space between them on the settee, and he put his arm around her, and she rested against him in the manner of 2 people who have shared enough of the same air that they have learned each other's fit. And the fire burned, and the house was quiet with sleeping children, and outside the window the desert stars were doing their work. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of what a life can be when the right door opens at the right moment. In the spring of 1886, Daniel was offered the opportunity to go to work for a large cattle operation in Texas for the summer, a chance to learn the broad operations of a significant ranch from people whose knowledge he could bring back. He was 15, and the decision was his to make, and he sat with Marcella and Jedediah and talked about it with the seriousness he brought to all consequential things. Jedediah told him exactly what it would teach him and what it would not teach him and what questions to ask when he got there and who to watch and what to watch for, and then he said, "It is a good opportunity. I would take it." Daniel looked at his mother. "Go," she said, "write to us." He went. He wrote long letters full of careful observation and the specific excitement of a boy encountering the large world, and he came back in September taller by 2 inches and with a quality of settled confidence that was new and that Marcella recognized as the first real installment of the man he was becoming. Eleanor, watching her brother return, announced that when she was old enough she intended to go somewhere herself, possibly to school in Santa Fe, possibly further. She had not decided yet, but she was going, and nobody around the table expressed any doubt that she would. The following years layered themselves with the compound richness of a life being lived forward rather than merely survived. The ranch continued to grow in the measured and careful way of Jedediah's management. Daniel worked alongside his stepfather through his teenage years with the focused dedication of someone building toward something specific, and by 18, he was genuinely indispensable in the operation of the North Pasture, making decisions with a competence that other ranchers in the territory came to recognize. Eleanor did go to Santa Fe at 17, to a school for young women run by the Sisters of Loretto, who were not afraid of Eleanor's opinions, and in fact seemed to view them as raw material rather than a problem. She came home on holidays with new books and new ideas and an increasingly precise command of both English and the Spanish she had been studying, and the dinner table discussions became, if anything, more interesting. Samuel at 8 was deeply involved in being Jedediah's shadow in a different way than Daniel had been, less about the horses and more about the mechanics of the whole operation, where things went and why, how decisions were made, what the numbers in the ledgers meant. He sat beside Marcella when she was working on the accounts and asked questions that were increasingly pointed for an 8-year-old, and she answered them directly because he deserved direct answers. Rose at 4 had resolved into a personality of concentrated sweetness and iron will, a combination that Marcella recognized as familiar. She wore her hair in 2 braids that she did not like being undone for any reason, and she had befriended every animal on the property from the barn cats to the more tolerant of the horses, to a particular hen named Prudence who had separated herself from the flock and taken up residence near the back porch, apparently by mutual agreement. Hazel, who was in his late 50s now and moving a little slower than he had been, remained an absolute fixture of the operation and of the family's life. He and Jedediah had been together long enough that their communication had reduced to a kind of telegraphic efficiency, and watching them work through a problem together was to observe the particular ease of 2 people who have learned to think in complementary directions. He still spent evenings teaching Eleanor and now Rose and Samuel the stars, though Eleanor was in Santa Fe most of the year, and the tradition had become so established that, when they were home, the 3 of them sat on the fence regardless of the cold and named every light in the sky. In the summer of 1888, Marcella was 36 years old and Jedediah was 44. And they rode out together to the high point above the North Pasture on a Saturday afternoon, just the 2 of them, the same point where they had stood the day the Harcastle land was bought. The territory had changed around them in 10 years, more settled, more connected to the wider country, the particular wildness of it moderated but not gone, still present in the scale of the landscape and the quality of the light, and the way the land met the sky at the horizon with the clean indifference of something that has been here longer than any human concern. They stood at the top and looked out over everything they had built, the ranch and the north pasture and the creek and the house with its east-facing garden where things were growing that she had planted and tended through 10 springs. "Do you ever think about what you would have done if the ranch had not worked?" she asked him. He thought about it honestly. "I would have done something else," he said. "Found another way." He looked at her. "I am not someone who stops." "No," she said, "you are not." "Are you?" he said. "I knocked on your door before dawn with nothing in my hands," she said. "So, no." He reached over and took her hand as they looked out over the land, and the afternoon light came down gold and long over the red earth and the juniper, and somewhere in the pasture below them, their children were doing what their children did, Daniel working the horses and Samuel asking questions of anyone in earshot, and Rose communing with the livestock and Alina, home for the summer, walking the fence line with a book in her hand and her nose in it, occasionally looking up to verify that the world was still there. "I want to tell you something," Jedediah said. She waited. "When I opened that door," he said, "when you were standing there in the dark before the sun came up and you looked at me and told me the truth just plainly without dressing it up or asking for anything except what was honest." He stopped, looked at the land, looked back at her. "I knew something was different. I did not know what yet, but something changed in me in that moment when you looked me in the eye and said what was true." She held his hand tighter. "I did not know it was the beginning of this," he said, gesturing slightly with his chin at the land and the house and the invisible weight of everything they had made together. "But I knew it was the beginning of something." She turned to face him fully, and he turned to face her, and they stood on the high ground above their land in the afternoon light of 1888, two people who had come to each other through the particular gate of need and honesty and the willingness to be seen, and who had built from that beginning a thing as solid and as real as the earth under their feet. "I love you," she said, because she said it when she meant it, and she meant it constantly but still said it at the moments when it was most true. "I know," he said, and then because he was Jedediah Finley, and the words were hard for him in the way that the truest things often are for the most solid people. "I love you. Every part of what you are. Every year of it." She kissed him on the top of that hill with the whole territory spread out around them, and he kissed her back with the warm and entire attention of a man who is exactly where he intended to be, and the wind moved through the junipers below them with a sound like something exhaling with satisfaction. 10 years after a woman in worn boots had crossed a frozen yard in the dark and knocked 3 quiet times on a stranger's back door, the Finley ranch sat solid and full under the New Mexico sky. 4 children and 5 ranch hands and 1 particularly opinionated hen named Prudence and 11 horses, and then some, and the accounts in order and the land producing well, and the garden on the east side of the house in full summer bloom. And on winter mornings still, Jedediah Finley rose before dawn and lit the stove and made the coffee, and on winter mornings still, Marcella came into the kitchen in the early dark and found him there, and the kitchen was warm and there were 2 cups on the table always already waiting, because he knew. He had always known. That was the truth of it. That was all of it. That was enough and more than enough, and it was theirs, fully and completely, closed and warm against the winter dark. A life built solid on the ground where a woman had once stood with nothing in her hands and knocked, quietly, asking only for the door to open. The door had opened. Everything good had come through it.